everybody, and welcome to Fraudible, the official podcast of the International Society of Economic and Criminology. Fraudible is the podcast that brings together academics and practitioners and to discuss all things fraud. In this episode, we're going to be discussing fraud and deepfakes and AI, and I'm delighted to be joined by academic Professor Sarah Kingston and practitioner Paul Maskall. Hi guys!
Hello. Hi Paul.
Thank you for joining me today. Sarah, could you give a brief introduction into you and your work, please?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for inviting me on, Claire, and thanks everybody for listening. So those of you who I don't know me, I'm Professor Sarah Kingston, based at the University of Lancashire, and my kind of work in the fraud space has been linked to liminality and liminal spaces, which I know is some of the things we're going to be talking a little bit about today, because AI is kind of a little bit of a liminal space, the unknown, the in-between. So I've spent many years as an academic working in the field of crime and policing, specifically around crime prevention. And so I'm interested in how we might prevent crime such as fraud. And I've also worked alongside an organisation that many of you might be familiar with, We Fight Fraud, worked in the field of looking at money muling, as well as thinking about those liminal spaces and how we might manipulate those liminal spaces within organisations and wider society to try to prevent and protect us from things such as fraud. I also manage a research team seconded to a police constabulary, as well as kind of my academic role as well. I am also director of the Northwest Social Science Doctoral Training Partnership based at the university. So if anybody who's listening to this or watching is interested in doctoral research and is seeking funding for that to get a scholarship, then there's a possibility of gaining funding through the Northwest Social Science Doctoral Training Partnership. And I'm happy to field any questions or queries that people have about doctoral funding as well.
Amazing.
So a little bit about me.
Thank you very much. Paul, same to you.
Hi everybody. Again, I've been on Fraudible before as well, and you probably recognise my face from a number of different bits because I tend to get about in reality, especially in fraud circles. But my name is Paul Maskall. I'm the Strategic Fraud Prevention and Behavioural Lead over at UK Finance. So from my point of view is that I kind of focus on kind of strategic fraud projects, especially in the best interest of not just the financial industry, but I also have this kind of identity crisis where I'm actually part funded not just by the financial industry in UK Finance, but also the City of London Police as their kind of national lead force function from their point of view. So I look a lot out how we, both as law enforcement and the financial industry, can work more closely together. Again, any project I undergo is in the best interest of both sides, but in reality, there isn't really many public protection projects that aren't necessarily in the best interest of both sides. So I, from my background, I've spent probably the last 15 years in law enforcement and security in various both public and private sector. I've worked in counterterrorism, I worked in cyber and fraud and intelligence, and for me, it's very much that kind of accumulation over the last 10 years is very much the focus on the victimology and the behavioural science as to why we as human beings are terrible generally at making decisions, and also the fact that actually why are we vulnerable to manipulation as it stands, but how is that very often compounded with the relationship we have with technology. So that's kind of generally the spinal column for most of the things I do and apply to. So yeah, that's me.
So you're both far too qualified to talk about AI and deepfakes then.
I don't think anybody is qualified to talk about it. I think that's a stretch. Like it's still early days.
Fair enough. Let's start off then, Paul. So you've said that we are, on the whole, very bad at making decisions. How does AI feed into that?
It's funny because obviously being within law enforcement, and I do a lot of kind of media stuff, etc., and a lot of the media questions that are fielded, it's like, well, what's the rise of AI facilitated crime and AI crime, and what are the stats that are surrounding a lot of these sorts of things? Because again, whether you're at a conference, whether it's conference bingo or what stats you're going to quote at an event or whichever, very often it's the case of like, oh, well, we're going to talk about AI because it's been the kind of buzzword conversation for quite some time, especially. And it's very often the case where you sort of kind of, for me at least, I kind of tend to boil it down to the fact that actually we're never really going to have some sort of metric to be able to measure AI crime. And it's really, really difficult to respond to that because it's not really what people want to hear. We want something tangible to understand. As Sarah quite rightly said, it still exists in this sort of abstract and liminal space in how it's applied. But in reality, AI applies to every possible thing we can imagine. And especially in our field, from a social engineering point of view, it facilitates and changes communication. So whether it's the communication which you're having, it's the content in which you're consuming, it is the things in which you read and consume and see online, etc. But at the best of times, human beings, from a confirmation bias point of view and our own perspectives, is we only really read what we want to read, we only believe what we want to believe, and we only follow what we want to follow. And that's been the case regardless of AI or regardless of social media, for instance, as well. But what I think from my point of view is the impact is that law enforcement and financial industry and most of us in this sort of counter fraud sector, we are concerned about the longer term implications of this. We've talked about these in politics and disinformation. For instance, a deep fake of Zelensky, and again, maybe when you see it in the cold light of day on the news, knowing already that it's a deep fake, so you're already prepped and primed to see that it is deep fake. But if you're in a foxhole on the Ukraine border, or in another location, or it's an emotional factor, or whatever it is, does the deep fake have to be that good? If the deep fake of the romance sort of scam and the manipulation comes through, and it's really validating that actually I do love you, I really care about you, I really look at the scenery that I've got, I'm on a beach somewhere, I'd really like you to come and join me, I just need another ticket price or another this or whichever, or investment. It's those methods that just provide that real hook that is able to be manipulated with the usage of that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
And we've already seen examples of it, absolutely. But it's just this whole idea that the provenance of content or the background of content, the assumed provenance, is just gone out of the window because it can just be fabricated out of nowhere. I think even giving advice around online dating now is that, well, you can reverse image search the image of an individual and see if it's matched to any of the profile, just out of due diligence if you are going on online dating. But can you do that now? Because how do you reverse image an AI image? So it's all these different nuanced changes that I don't think, as you quite rightly said, Sarah, regulation, perception has not been able to take into account.
I think going back to just to the example of romance scams and, all different types of investment fraud, people who are perpetrating this, as you mentioned earlier, Paul, are often spending significant amounts of time doing this to multiple people. They're very experienced. They know what they're doing because they've had practice, they've been trained, they've been immersed in this field for some time often. And they have this ability to manipulate because they're very experienced in what they're doing. And if you're a single person who's recently come out of a relationship or is looking for a new relationship, you haven't been spending lots of time in the dating field. Know what has and hasn't changed. I remember myself going back on the dating scene many years ago and reflecting on how much it had changed since I'd previously been in the kind of dating field. And obviously you as an individual in those spaces or in those types of engagement are quite novice, whereas the fraudster is very experienced. Added a layer of technology that is designed, or they've been designed to manipulate you, it's not difficult to see how people are being manipulated and defrauded in these scenarios. And hence why, if people are listening to this who have been the victim of this type of fraud, feel some level of individual responsibility, I encourage you, I'm sure Paul will be the same from what he said, that you don't feel that there's a complete burden on you, because actually these people are very professional, they're very experienced, and the technology is such that it is very effective in faking and manipulating the images that you see. I mean, we've seen some really high profile cases where, people in large corporations have been defrauded and have sent millions of pounds. I mean, many of us have heard of the case in Hong Kong where an employee thought that they were speaking to the chief finance officer and transferred over £25 million for a video conference call because the audio and the video was so sophisticated that it was believable. And this is somebody who's working in clearly from £25 million in a very, very high profile and very lucrative area. Similarly, we've seen other cases of a UK energy CEO who transferred again money over to what they thought was a supplier of a Hungarian company. So, feeling this individual responsibility in things such as romance scams, we've got professionals who work in finance who are transferring over large amounts of money. And that demonstrates to us, I think, that the level of skill and craft that many of these fraudsters have in terms of being able to manipulate people to defraud them. So, the sophistication there is such that many people are being manipulated by this technology.
And I think very often it comes down to this goes for everything, is that when I've done things like consultancy and kind of get advice and guidance for businesses, and we've talked about insider risk, and we've talked about a number of different elements. And very often it does come down to the fact is like, how do I as an individual convince you that I am who I say I am? Now, I hope that, again, that I don't think Deepfake is quite that good to match me right now on Fraudible, but it really does come down to the fact that actually is that whether it be an email, whether it be a number, I've got a number of different methods of communication which you can engage with me in order to convince it. Now, those social media, we'll do some open source investigation on me, etc., and I'll have some social media pages. But what was the KYC or know your customer in order to create that profile in the first place? There wasn't anything. In that number, if I've just created that number and that's my methodology in communicating, etc., how do I verify that number is indeed linked to you? Well, I can't. That email, when I create that email, yes, okay, it's got my name in it, but actually in reality, was there any provenance or linkages to that? Is that, dare I ask that AI makes, I think, the argument for things like digital identity even more valid, I think, and the whole principle is that I can fabricate every possible touch point easier online in order to engage with you, to make you believe that I am indeed who I say I am. I've done a lot of sessions around investment scams. Oh, well, check the FCA register, whether that business is registered with the FCA. I'm like, yeah, but he could just be impersonating the real company, and it could have been, and again, creating a decent fish kit on the basis of AI and creating a logo and creating copy just like that to be able to fabricate those touch points. And those touch points are the real key element. How do I create our method of communication? This even goes to things like SIM swap fraud in relation to phones, etc. Like, okay, well, whose fault is it when somebody's phone is compromised? Yes, but how did I convince the phone company or organisation that I was the one who owned the new number? So it's all these sorts of things that actually AI tends to degrade. That's the word I'm looking for. Our ability to identify ourselves. Or to trust in identity. And I think, that might be a bit flowery and social sciencey, but I think it's really crucial because this is the longer term view that we're seeing, is that if you've swapped your phone and I need to verify that you are indeed the account holder and you need to download your banking app to your new phone, how do I communicate with you? Well, the only way I've got to communicate with you is your number or your email. And how do I convince that? There is no KYC in any of these processes to convince it actually to be able to do it or to verify it. So I think this is a larger, dare I say, a philosophical concern on the basis of saying, actually, this all makes digital ID so much more viable and so much more important, whether it ever happens in our lifetime or not. I look at. But this
Shadow's come to join us.
It's very much that.
But yeah, and this also brings us on to liminality, Sarah. I did not know what it meant until I read the research that you had done. As a concept, it's so interesting, though. Could you explain what it is and how the AI and the deepfake topics kind of feed into that as well?
Yeah, so liminal spaces or liminality is a concept that's used to describe a space or a place that's kind of the in-betweenness, the ambiguous spaces. So I often use analogies of where you might go somewhere you've not been before. Say we were due to meet in a building in Manchester that was kind of, used by many different organisations, and we're hiring a space there. The liminal spaces are those that we're kind of not familiar with, are the in-between space. So I kind of know when I see you in person that I'm probably in the right space, given that I've met you at this venue. But up until that point, I'm not fully sure if I'm entering the right building, am I going to the right room, somebody directs me to go to a different space. And it's that kind of unknown space that is kind of the liminal areas of society. And it kind of relates to AI because, again, when we're engaging with technology, when we're on our phones, when we're on the internet, when we're logging into devices, when we're accessing the World Wide Web, we're engaging in spaces that we're kind of familiar with, but we don't really know what the spaces we're engaging with. So again, that liminal space is all around us, but in the context of technology and AI, it's a perfect opportunity for fraudsters to manipulate the engagement patterns that we have in society through our phones, text message, WhatsApps, the internet, emails, as you mentioned, Paul. Those liminal spaces, the ones where we kind of think we know what we're doing, but we really don't, can mean that the fraudster can manipulate us, whether that be through a link because you've received a parcel and you've not paid the fee. You kind of understand that you're engaging with parcel delivery because maybe you've got a parcel that's being sent to you, but you're in a liminal space because you don't fully know until that parcel's being delivered what that process is behind the scenes. You might not know DPD very well. You might not know their processes. You might not know how they contact their clients without really checking that out. So it's those liminal spaces, those in-betweenness, the unknown, that means that fraudsters can manipulate those. And certainly with the use of deep fake and AI techniques, it means that they can manipulate your WhatsApp messages or a video call, send you a link. You think you're communicating with one person, but actually you're not, because you're not regulating WhatsApp. You're accessing that platform and you're trusting WhatsApp to regulate that space. You're a user, you're not, contacting that person to make sure it's there in different sorts of ways all the time. So it's those in-between spaces that mean that fraudsters can manipulate those, and we think that liminality is a useful way to kind of explain that. And it's all around us.
Yeah, 100%. And it's interesting because, again, when we talk about education in this space and prevention in this space, is the expectation that, oh, by the way, you will be invulnerable to just trust your gut, and therefore you will be invulnerable to any sort of manipulation online. Again, we've got things like scam checkers out there, and a number of different platforms out there that are providing scam checkers, which is fantastic. But also the big concern that I have is that actually you're not necessarily going to be a victim of the scam that you're checking. It's very much going to be in the situation where the one that you are manipulated and victimized by is the one that you don't necessarily think is going to victimize you in those sorts of situations, whether that's an individual, whether that's a partner, whether that's whatever the situation, because everybody's been told something that they wanted to hear at probably the wrong time you should have said it or should have heard it in those sorts of situations. But what the liminal space really does, and this kind of abstract concept of most of our relationship with technology, is that it opens up for entire emotional projection. And that's the real crucial part for me, is it because you create the narrative. Like criminals, yes, they are more sophisticated. They are utilizing technology, utilizing sophistication. They are incredibly good at this, but it is marketing. Like that's it. If I have a number of leads, if I was to use marketing terminology, is that if I send it to 100,000 people and actually I get 1,000 back that say, oh, by the way, yes, I'm very interested in this opportunity, or yes, I'm really interested in you too, or whatever the flavor of manipulation that is, or oh, that product looks interesting, I'll buy it. It's very much the case where it is a numbers game, But what we are on our side is rampantly subjective because, as Sarah quite rightly said, this liminal space allows for you to fill in the gaps. Is that
fraudster becomes, in those liminal spaces, a knowledgeable actor. So if I just use the analogy I gave before of us going to a building we've never been to before, in those liminal spaces, the fraudster can become the knowledgeable actor. So I'm unsure where to go to this new building, so someone takes me over to one side and says, "Sarah, you need to give some ID. I need to see some verification." They could quite quickly, take a screenshot or a quick image of my bank card, or if I've got any staff card, they might take that information. They might ask me questions about where I'm from, what am I doing there, I need to take some personal information. And because I've not been to that building before, my guard might be down somewhat because I'm thinking I've met the knowledgeable actor who's going to guide me through that unknown space. Because it's the first time I've been there. I don't know where I'm going. I'm hoping that someone's going to show me. And that's, I guess, what liminal spaces provides to fraudsters is the ability for them to manipulate those unknown spaces to come in as the person who does know what to do in those unknown spaces, such as engaging in WhatsApp, such as engaging with parcel force, with investments. They are manipulating the situation that you might be unfamiliar with, whether that be romance and dating. You've not been on the dating scene for 20 years. The knowledgeable actor then takes advantage of that and therefore guide you in a way that you might not have known that you should or shouldn't be doing. So that's kind of also important about liminal spaces, is that ability to manipulate that unknownness for their own advantage, to cast themselves as the knowing person. One of the analogies that's often used is around marriage, the passage of going through certain types of activities or actions in society. We kind of have a level of expectation of what might happen on a date, for example. If you've not met someone before, we might have some expectation about what shouldn't happen on a first date. But ultimately, it's kind of ambiguous. We don't really know what might happen on a first date. Might be a long time since we've done that. And a knowledgeable actor, or the person who's trying to manipulate themselves to be the knowledgeable actor, will take advantage of that. And therefore, hence why people can be manipulated in those liminal spaces.
And because we can't see them, we can't touch them, we can't necessarily engage with them. And I think in investment scams as well, as using an example, is that if I had 50 grand magically, if only, to invest in whatever it was going to be, and I had that money and I wanted to invest, etc., it was very much the case where I struggle with the education sometimes and the kind of vague nature of the kind of education, because it's very much the case that if I was to invest traditionally in the stock market, etc., I am coming at it. I know nothing about investments. I know nothing where to start or how to go do it kind of optimally, etc. And very often it was kind of like I would like to go to a broker in order to utilize their experience, because I believe if I paid them a certain amount of percentage to manage my portfolio, for instance, I would most likely get a better return on my money from somebody who has the expertise and, again, that kind of knowledgeable actor in this sort of situation in order to do so. When crypto and cryptocurrency investment scams come into the mix, very often the education is the opposite. It's like, well, no, you need to have control over your crypto. You need to be able to do all this, etc. But if I had 50 grand and, I get by on crypto, but I would have no idea really where to start. I teach crypto and cryptocurrency, etc. But even then, actually, there's other elements of maximizing my portfolio. Why wouldn't I have somebody that comes out of the woodwork and engage with that to provide it? Now, but when it goes over to the emotion, because again, all of these are emotional aspects. Now, I joke in so many of my presentations that if I could afford therapy for the entire UK population or for everybody, this would fix a lot of our problems. But that's not necessarily feasible. But it's very much the case of it's the emotional need. Like if you play the National Lottery, for instance. Now, if you go into the National Lottery, you pick the numbers, etc., and you wait for the Friday night or the Monday night or the Saturday night call. When you pick those numbers, I don't know about you, but I start to build a picture. I'm like, imagine if I actually did win that money. What was if I actually got that money, and what would I do with my life if I'm preparing myself for evidently the literal once in a million chance of me actually winning it? But I start to build a story. I start to fantasize. I start to build a concept and a narrative around what that would mean. And when the draw comes, inevitably that story is gone. But what happens when the draw never comes? Because when you start to build that story, when you're doing it, whether this the love of your life, the individual you want to do, the product that you want to buy, the investment, the changing your life, there is an emotional need being met in whatever capacity it's going to be. But if I move, labouring the analogy, and I move the drawer and I keep it going, how does that narrative build over time? And I think that's the really crucial bit, because if that draw never comes and the way in which I engage with you becomes more, dare I say it, sophisticated, or it becomes more believable or more convincing, or that actually it's a lot more accessible and easy for creating, whether it's imagery or etc. Our vulnerability is fundamentally created and cultivated by the content we choose to consume or not to choose to consume. So I think it's again, not to try to be sort of kind of dystopian and apocalyptic in this respect. This is the biggest concern I have longer term, is that actually we need to protect the public at source. In reality, we cannot rely on education as much as we would like to. But what is actually the art of the possible of people in the counter-fraud industry in order to stop that?
Yeah, I think concerns that's really driven my interest in this is, I mean, I have a young daughter, and I just think about her future, of what it's going to be like if she gets a phone call from mum, or a potential, or I get a phone call. I mean, we've heard of instances where parents have had phone calls that have been ransom claims, that have been deep fakes, are not true. So it's certainly a concern of mine, is thinking about that potential future for young people and elderly population. Again, if you've got impairments and you can't detect even a poor deep fake, I mean, they're improving all the time, but a poor deep fake, if you've got, think about my, grandparents, parents, some visual impairments mean that they might not be able to even look at ones that, that's not great. Just thinking about going back to your point earlier, Paul, about emotions and how that's important. I think as well as that, as thinking about broader society as well, because obviously as society change, and you mentioned consumption patterns. I mean, when I think about consumption, I always think it's a sociological term called conspicuous consumption, which is basically how people want to buy things that they see is some way attributable to them. So, for example, if brand X is in the media every day, and it's on Facebook, it's on Twitter, it's on this platform, that might then be an indication of the potential future fraud activities. Because if people are consuming in a particular area, then it may be likely that fraudsters are going to manipulate those spaces, because they know that consumption patterns will mirror what societal expectations are. Often people are influenced by, you talked about marketing, Paul, influenced by marketing, and also what people were surrounded by, that can influence both people's engagement patterns, but also the activities of fraudsters, where they can think they can manipulate more people. More people are buying X, then there's a possibility there for them to manipulate more people. So wider societal trends and expectations can have an influence in terms of what people's activities are, as well as their emotions as well. We're driven by those, but also by, I guess, I always kind of see this in the sense of a person sat on your shoulder, which is this wider society saying, oh, you want to buy this? So you watched an advert earlier about X, Y, and Z. You might want to consider buying this. And that can really influence people's engagement patterns, and as well as fraudsters.
And that's the thing, is it's this sort of situation where I've seen it very much so, especially in the last 6 months or so, where we've had a lot of displacement. So the banks have put in a lot of different, especially since kind of the PSR regulation changes and all these sorts of things, and reimbursement. But the banks have done, even in the last 4 or so years I've worked in UK finance and across law enforcement, etc., is that the amount of changes that are being brought in to circumvent a lot of this. So actually being able to open a bank account as a money launderer or as a criminal is increasingly difficult, and the actual interventions have increased as well on the side of actually stopping the victim being a victim in the first place. But it's also the case where we've seen this massive displacement over to things like, again, gold bullion, gift cards. We've sort of regressed in a number of different ways, where they're kind of skipping to the integration phase of money laundering, but looking at the products and the ability for you to hand over that. Now, I do a lot of work in the gift card space as well. And in reality is that you have a gift card to try and roughly apply it in this sort of space, is that is also a kind of a liminal space. It's not money, it's not otherwise. It's this kind of handing over this, like, am I incentivized to report it in the same sort of way? All these sorts of things and how they are utilized from a criminal point of view. But on top of this is that, from a criminology point of view, what does AI and the deepfake and the idea of actually bringing people into the criminality in the first place? So whether that is money mules or individuals becoming criminals in the first place. So I talk a lot on the kind of the differential association point. So essentially the criminal, well, again, I'm no criminologist, but I'm pretty sure it's the criminological version of saying falling in with the wrong crowd. And I've spoken for a good 10 years on the online enabled element of differential association, because you can in order to fall into the wrong crowd, there'd be hundreds and hundreds of societal and environmental factors in order for you to fall in with that crowd. The thing is now is that, like, actually I can Google a community of millions of people who believe in what I believe, whether that's been good or not. The online behavior and online sort of life, online normalized behavior, whatever your behavior is, whether that be good or bad. So it's this sort of situation where I've seen a lot of kind of the usage of AI in the marketing for get rich quick schemes, money muling, all these sorts of things that of utilizing that content and then marketing and actually bringing people into that fold as well. And even from a carding site point of view, and people utilizing details and carding sites to just make purchases because they just want a new pair of trainers, or they want the new PlayStation, or whatever the case may be. Because I don't have to see the lights in their eyes, it is still a very much liminal space on that basis. So I don't have the emotional boundary to stop me doing it in the first place. So it's how that larger consumptive societal model will also influence the fraud in the future.
Whenever I think about sort of prevention, Paul, as you were talking there, my visual brain goes to, have you seen when you go to like a game place, arcade, that was the word I was looking for, and they have the game where you've got the baton and these little figures pop up and you've got to hit them down. That's kind of how I see what you're talking about, Paul, the analogy of once you've got this prevention, one pops up, and I kind of see it in this way that people are constantly trying to bash the thing down. And that was what we're trying to do in kind of preventative approach, is try to stop this. It's popping up all over the place dependent on patterns, on prevention activities, whether that be temporal, spatial, functional displacement, because that often is what happens. People don't necessarily just displace functionally. They might go to another type of crime. They might do it different times of the day. They might go spatially to different areas. So it's often a geographical spread as well as a functional spread in different types of activities. It's a very sophisticated network of activities that are taking place, and that will shift and shape and change over time and dependent on our responses to it. And hence why I often think, as an individual, feeling responsible and ashamed of this. And I know, and I'm sure you both and people who are listening will have known people who've been the victim of fraud and maybe as well deepfake, and feel a level of responsibility for that, and would really encourage people not to feel ashamed, because these people are very, very sophisticated. And I know Tony from We Fight Fraud is often saying, he was, when he was a fraudster, prior to being convicted, was spent all of his time. He was very experienced, using the analogy of being a football player. You're going to play with a sophisticated professional footballer. You're not going to have that competitive edge, because they've been doing this for many, many years and many, many hours. Sorry, my brain just goes to that analogy thing. When you go to the arcade next, that's kind of what I see when I think about. But this
is exactly the issue, is that law enforcement, financial industry, I would say the larger counter-fraud industry, everybody who is invested in protecting the public in this space and reducing the crime in its first instance, is we are in a very reactive space, like an incredibly reactive space. And the main analogy I really labour is that, like, what generally reduced the prevalence of smoking in this country, like, quite considerably. It wasn't necessarily, here's the black lung and this is all the horrible things that can, how you're going to die horribly and early, etc. Like that. It's not necessarily that, but it was actually more on the basis that we actually facilitated and changed the environment. So you weren't able to necessarily smoke in public places, etc. And that kind of gradually changed over time and all these sorts of things. So is this sort of situation where we were able to design out, in some cases, we were able to kind of change a lot of different behaviours and for better or worse, depending on which side of the fence you sit. But very often it's the case where this is really, and I would argue that fraud and scams is a symptom of a much larger problem in relation to this relationship with technology. It's crime that exists in that abstract and liminal space, like disinformation, radicalization, online sexual exploitation, all these sorts of things, is because they exist in that liminal space. Both, you don't necessarily have the motivation to protect yourself from it in the first place because you cannot have an emotional image to conjure the issue. You don't see it as a motivating factor. But also, it's the first time that law enforcement and the wider counter-fraud community have no ability to change your environment. Like, we don't have a massive, like, we would like more, but we don't have a huge amount of impact on your social media or in your feed. We don't have a huge amount of impact on your device as you're looking at your screen now. We don't have a huge amount of impact to intervene at source where we can design out a lot of these sorts of threats. We are reliant on your education. Like, if there's a spate of burglary in your area, there might be increased police presence. There might be, and again, because of that actual image, if I say burglary, you can imagine the actual threat and risk to you. I don't necessarily have to give you the top 10 tips to protect yourself from burglary in your area, because you start locking your door and making sure of it, and there's an extra element of vigilance. But we just don't do that with fraud because of the number of the cognitive heuristics that come into it. So it's this sort of situation where actually, like, how do we change the environment? And yes, that is the legislative element. That is the relationship we have with the tech industry. It is the relationship we have with the telecoms industry as well, in relation to how do we design out that when actually the longer sort of dystopian view is, how can education really work in this space if at some point, theoretically, you're not going to be able to discern what is real and what's not. And that sounds a bit awful.
It does, and I'm afraid we have to stop there. So I'm going to end the episode on.
We'll start talking about nudge theory. But I
know, yeah, that's another podcast as well.
We shall come on to that in a future episode on fraud and nudge theory. Let's get it booked. Let's do it. In this episode, we've been talking about fraud and deepfakes and AI, and I'd like to thank my guests, Sarah and Paul, for joining me. Thank you very much, both of you. My name's Claire Maillet, and this is Fraudible.